We've had the farm here for about 6 years. It's a seasonal operation, so we winter over egg layers. So we have about 400 egg layers that we have year round, and then in the spring and summer we do meat birds, so broilers that are on the pasture. So we can have up to 800 at a time or 1,200 at a time. So we're somewhere between 800 and 1,600 birds. Those costs vary, dramatically based on weather and as we scale, we're a relatively young farm by comparison. But as we scale, those costs get diluted because there's infrastructure costs that you're not accounting for that year because they've been done a year before or 2 years before, whatever the case might be. But on average, we're talking about a cost that would be probably double or triple what the industrial commodity bird would cost. So we're looking at somewhere around $5 to $7 a bird.
We can think of our chickens as two separate enterprises. We have the egg layers and the broiler chickens, the meat birds. Two separate breeds, two completely different ways that we raise them. So with the meat birds, we have them in what's called chicken tractors. They're floorless structures that get moved every single day. And what we've done is we know what our ground can metabolize as far as nutrient load from those birds per square foot. So we know the square footage of that shelter that they're in. We know it's there for 24 hours a year. It gets moved once a day, and it's only on that spot once a year. So we want to make sure that the animals that we have, the ground can support in a way that we don't have runoff, we don't have nutrient overload, and we have a density population that allows us to build dirt and build soil based on our rotation process instead of deteriorating the land. We're creating a paradigm that is completely separate from the commodity chicken industry that we have in Maryland right now. We're out to prove a concept that we can rotate animals together around a pasture, build dirt, and increase the nutrient density without any harmful effects to the environment, and produce more food per acre, more nutrient dense real food per acre than a commodity operation where you have a grain that's being imported into a central area with chicken houses and a manure lagoon or a manure pit or whatever the case might be, and then it's spread on the pasture. And you'll see it right now. Farmers are spreading manure right now because they don't have anything else to do. It's wintertime. That's a ridiculous concept, though, because the ground can't metabolize that right now, and it's all running off. When we get natural storms, hurricanes, whatever the case might be, all that is being pushed out into those waterways. We don't have that collection, and we're very much out to prove this concept that we can produce food for our community, keep it local, and not harm the environment, actually build soil, build a healthy environment. I think that, prior to several years ago when we started this, I didn't think about what I ate. I didn't think that, hey, where did this come from? How did it get here? How's it grown? What are the costs? Not only the sticker price, but what are the environmental, transportation, whatever. But I think when it's all said and done, we can continue to eat meat as long as it's raised in a way that complements the environment.
Dr. Susan Gressens. My specialty is in aquatic ecology, freshwater ecology, and looking at the interactions between dissolved nutrients, algae, and grazing invertebrates, mostly in streams, but since I've come to Maryland, I've been learning a lot more about the Chesapeake Bay, working with local water monitoring groups. Okay, so the idea is you've got the chicken sheds with 100,000 chickens in them, and out obviously there's a lot of chicken waste in bedding, and given that chickens are warm-blooded and they eat a lot of grain, they don't use all the phosphorus, so it builds up in the bedding, and there's obviously a volume of this, and it makes sense, you know, to recycle that and put it on the field. Normally, phosphorus would escape if it's sticking to soil particles that washed off in the rainfall, so you definitely, you know, have to be careful to prevent erosion. And soils have a tendency to absorb phosphate molecules to their surface and hang on to them, except for certain circumstances, but there comes, the soils have kind of like a chemical sponge capacity, so they can absorb, but given the particular kind of soils, eventually the particles of the tiny soils will eventually get saturated with phosphorus, in which case they can't hold anymore, and then if you put more on, if it's in a condition where it can dissolve in soil moisture, if the soils run out of oxygen, if they're very soggy, depending on some of the chemicals in the soils. Once the soils become saturated, then the phosphate could actually trickle through in the groundwater and get out into the bay. The problem with excessive phosphorus, it is a limiting nutrient in the bay, particularly at certain times of year. I think earlier in the season, the amount of phosphorus is what's limiting the growth of floating phytoplankton algae in general. And so the more phosphorus gets in the water, the more these floating algae can grow and proliferate. They're taking up the phosphorus. The major problems then are that the density of these floating plankton is so great, the water's just murky. And then actually anything that's not in the top, you know, couple of inches or meters of the water, any other kinds of plants, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay, the submerged aquatic vegetation, the rooted plants, have historically been really, really crucial to providing oxygen at depth because they're rooted on the bottom, and as long as they get enough light, they're doing photosynthesis, releasing oxygen, and that's crucial to keeping all the animals alive at depth. And if you have very cloudy surface water, you totally cut off a lot of these rooted plants at depth, and then there's not as much oxygen production, and given the salt layering in the bay, the oxygen that is produced isn't getting down to depth very well. Meanwhile, all those algae growing up at the surface, they get old, they die, they rain down to the bottom and decompose, and you're actually losing oxygen at the bottom and not replenishing it, and so that is, you know, fatal to any like crabs or particularly oysters, anything living at depth. So there still is an issue about, well, how do you get the phosphorus physically away from our area and take it someplace else? So it sounds like the soils really are getting close to saturation if they're not already over. And so now it becomes an economic question about, well, what do you do with it? I was aware that they were talking about using the chicken bedding with the feces as well as the various carbon-containing materials, using that as fuel and actually trying to do some energy generation with it. I haven't kept up on the details to know what the downsides of that would be, but you'd think, given, you know, the coal-powered plants that we have in Ohio, you'd think there ought to be a way to do that and not cause excessive air pollution, actually, that would be beneficial. So I don't know the details on that. And then otherwise, where do you ship it or do something to bring it back someplace else where it's more in need? I don't see it as like the chicken farmers versus the environment. I see it as Marylanders really like to eat chicken, and it's cheaper to grow it on the Eastern Shore, and so I think it would be fair that consumers are paying a little bit more, the companies that are having the food manufactured, the produce, the consumers. It's like we should be paying more in some fashion to arrange to have the chicken manure dealt with in an environmentally sensitive way. So maybe, what is it, if you could combust it and then take the ashes out someplace else, that would be more efficient. The question is how you would actually do that in practice. You know, if there would be a sales tax on chicken or something, or if they just do some, maybe more importantly, just, have to negotiate something with the manufacturers who you know, if they pass that on to the consumers or something, and I could see how you might actually have to have some regulation, you know, to make sure that it gets dealt with, but you have to provide a revenue stream. I think that we're really not paying the true cost of eating chicken at the consumer's level, and somewhere between the manufacturing companies that produce, and the people who are buying the chicken, we really need to come up to the bat, and then perhaps the state or, you know, the EPA needs to make sure that it gets taken care of.